Our next presenter has traveled the world to talk about life on the autism spectrum and consult on adult issues pertinent to education, relationships, employment, advocacy, and disclosure. Professor at Adelphi University, author of various books including Beyond the Wall, Personal Experiences with Autism and Asperger's Syndrome, and board member of the Asperger's Syndrome and High Functioning Autism Association, the Autism Services Association, and other autism-related organizations, we are really honored to have Dr. Short with us today.
Thanks for a great presentation to open the program and talk about the important work that Giant Steps is doing. I particularly like the involvement of music. Music was important in what we now call it early intervention. And one of the things that I do is give music lessons to children on the autism spectrum. And anybody involved with that, anybody involved with organizations such as System knows the power of music to reach people when other means of communication, such as verbal interaction, are just not available. So music is really great stuff, and we'll get into a little bit more about that as time goes on. So as we consider how we look at autism, and I heard some of that in a talk that Nick gave, and that is, we need to look at what people with autism can do. What can people with autism do? We need to get away from what I call the deficit model. A child is diagnosed with autism, the first thing a parent hears are all the things that the child won't be able to do, all the difficulties that will occur, all the things that you have to do to get ready for a life of disability and disorder and all kinds of distance. However, what if we looked at the characteristics of autism? It's not neither good nor bad, but just as they are. And in doing so, what strengths can people with autism have? What if a doctor told a parent while the child was being diagnosed, or the parent is being given information about the diagnosis, and the conversation went something like this. And from our diagnostic procedures, we see that your child has very strong visual skills. And the way that you can help your child be most successful is to teach visually, and here's a couple of examples, and here's some resources that will help you in doing so. Or the child perhaps is more auditory based or text based, or whatever it might be, and begin by giving advice on how the child may be successful in achieving goals in their life. And in that way, we can reframe how we consider the characteristics of communication, social interaction, restricted interest, and all those areas that are used to consider whether a person's on the autism spectrum. So as we look at what people with autism can do, the first question is, how does that individual spend most of their time? Or would they spend most of their time if they had the opportunity? And what can we do to use that interest and that strength, the motivating power behind that special interest, as Nick mentioned before, and as, I don't remember the gentleman's name next to Nick, but...
Nick. Another Nick.
Oh, that makes it easy, okay. All right, as Nick number 2 mentioned, you see an interest, you go with it, you run with it, and see where it takes you, whether the child has autism or not, but especially if the child has autism or some other condition. So how does the person spend most of their time? And that will lead you directly to matching to vocational and avocational possibilities. What are the abilities of that individual? At age 4, my parents caught me in the kitchen taking apart a watch with a sharp kitchen knife. Okay, there might be some abilities there that we can work with. What are the interests? What kind of mind does the individual with autism have? Most of us think of people with autism being visually based, and most of us are, but the key word is most and not all. But what we can say is that whatever the learning characteristics of that individual with autism is that it's going to be to some sort of extreme, and often to the exclusion of other modalities. And that's something that's so important to be aware of in terms of assessing, in terms of education, and in that way, making sure that whatever we're assessing for, a disability doesn't get in the way. So for example, the child who's having extreme difficulty in the physical act of writing, we need to remove the physical act of writing way so that the child is free in being able to demonstrate whatever they've mastered. And again, the characteristics. So let us begin with a little bit about me. Things were pretty typical for me at first. My mother had a 2-hour labor, 24 hours of age. My mother said, my wife says I look like an egg. Then the autism bomb exploded. At 18 months, like what happens to about half of us. Loss of functional communication, meltdowns, withdrawal from the environment. And in short, I became a very autistic little kid. The questions were, where does this come from? What can we do about it? So on that note, speaking of music, and I want the two Nicks especially involved, let us sing to the tune of Where Oh Where Has This Little Dog Gone? Ready, go. Where, oh where did this autism come from? Both from the back. Oh where can it be? Both from the tenor. When it stops on and eye contact got short. Oh where can it be from? And I think with a little bit of more work, working on intonation, breath support, we'll be ready for the summer concert. And I bring this up because there are still so many questions as to where autism comes from. However, we know a little bit more about what to do with autism. And that becomes particularly important as autism seems to be delivered to us daily via Federal Express. By the truckload. The CDC is now talking about 1 in 68. And if the rate keeps increasing the way it has been, probably within the next generation there's going to be more of us with autism than without. So we're taking over. And I bring up Federal Express because research suggests, if you look at the numbers, that over the past generation, the prevalence rate has gone from 1 in 10,000 to now 1 in 68. There's also been a sharp increase in the number of Federal Express packages being delivered. So that means, looking at that correlation, which is pretty good, we can blame it on Federal Express. It has to do with the packages being delivered. And I just bring this up because you're all laughing at the foolishness of what I just said. But we also tend to look at some really foolish things about what the causes of autism might be. And we really don't know. We've got a lot of clues and no specifics. And what I'm calling for is some more good research into what might be the true causes of autism. And we don't know. Most likely, there are many paths to autism. I also bring up Federal Express because I also wonder if this sharp increase has to do with awareness, whether some of it does. And as we consider in the past, people who might have been considered having mental retardation now considered an intellectual disability, people who considered having a minimal brain dysfunction, just being plain old weird, or being FLK, which is an educational term for a funny looking kid. Now we know that it has autism. Now we know that that's autism. And we combine that perhaps with some environmental toxicities, and we're ending up with an awful lot of autism. But I think that the fact that we're getting better at recognizing it when we see it has some implication. Just as with Federal Express, some of you may not have noticed the arrow between the E and the X, which I just outlined. How many of you have seen that, have noticed that arrow before? All right, so a small percentage, but now you all see it. You all see the arrow. And as Roy Brinker points out, as he does this in his presentation, now that I've made you aware of this arrow, even if I take it away, you can't help but see it. So next time you see a Federal Express truck going down the street, maybe you see a package at home, your eye's going to be drawn to that. And just as I've increased your ability to diagnose white space arrows and Federal Express logo, maybe society is better at recognizing autism when it sees it. So what do we do about autism? What can we do to help individuals on the autism spectrum? When the autism bomb exploded in my case, it took my parents a full year to find a place for diagnosis. Finally, at 2.5, the doctor said they had never seen a child who was so sick. And fortunately, my parents refuted the professional's recommendations for institutionalization. And just like we see so many parents today, they advocated on my behalf, And they convinced the school to take me in about a year. And it was during that year that my parents implemented what we would today refer to as an intensive home-based early intervention program, emphasizing music, movement, sensory integration, narration, and imitation. This is just today's terminology. In those days, it was just parents doing what they needed to do in order to connect with their child. So what did they do? It was mostly my mother. My dad was there too, but in those days it was his job to hunt a saber-toothed tiger or a mastodon. And the mommy stayed home and did mommy things. First she tried to get me to imitate her. That didn't work. So then she flipped it around and she began to imitate me. And once she did that, I became aware of her in my environment. And I believe the key educational implication is that before any good teaching goes on, you have to develop a trusting relationship with the learner. Then you can move on. I believe that we have the ability, and we have some real feedback violations too. Now, I believe we have the ability, we have the technology, we have the know-how, so that people with autism leading fulfilling and productive lives can become the rule rather than the exception. So instead of looking at the closed door of disability and disorder, let's move towards an ability-based model. And rather than autism being a bomb, let's make autism da bomb. And how does autism become da bomb? And again, it has to do with strengths. Let's consider a situation possibly like Robert, who provides transportation system information to lost patrons at Penn Station in New York, a really busy station. And someone like him, for example, we consider the characteristics and what employment implications exist. Well, you ask somebody for directions. How do you want to receive those directions? How does that match up with individuals who, well, we used to diagnose them with Asperger's syndrome, but now we can't do that anymore with the DSM-5. But I think you know what I'm getting at. Those of us who are verbal and on the spectrum, you may agree that our verbal characteristics tend to be detailed, factual, data-driven, sometimes too truthful, repetitive. And how many times have you asked someone to repeat directions when you're lost? So I think it works. Social interaction. It's pretty predictable. A brief greeting, a request for directions. Robert's happy to provide those directions, and then a brief goodbye. Where does he get this information? Co-workers have to look it up in a reference. This is one of his special interests. The third most common special interest, according to Tony Atlas. I don't know what the 1 and 2 are, but he said that's the third. He's got it memorized. That's one of his focused interests, passion, deep interest. So if we look at it that way, we now have an individual who, just because he has autism, because he has these characteristics, he outperforms his typical coworkers. And this is how we need to take a look at autism. This is how we need to take a look at the characteristics. What can we do to use the strengths so that individuals with autism can lead a fulfilling and productive life to our greatest potential? So as we look about setting the stage for lifelong success, these are some of the important areas that we need to consider. Interdependence. I think we overuse the word independence. The last time I checked, there's only hermits who live independently. Everybody else, well, think about it. Do we want somebody who is independent and feels that they don't need to interact with others and communicate with others in order to go about their lives? Or do we want someone who is interdependent and interacting in the community? And one way to look at it is that I'd probably be right in guessing that nobody built the chair that you're sitting on. Nobody welded the thing together. But nobody's going to bust you up and say you don't have enough skills and independence because you didn't build the chair. Ah, that's a good one. We can get any more explosions like that. And nobody, you didn't build the chair, you appropriately depended on somebody else to build the chair that you're sitting on, to build this room that you're sitting in, to fix your car when it needs repairing. So as we consider these characteristics, sometimes the computer has a mind of its own. It flips around. Employment. Most of us have to work for a living. That includes those of us on the autism spectrum. If we get the match right between the strengths and characteristics of a job, we can have opportunities for great productivity and fulfillment for anybody, whether you have autism or not, but especially for those of us with autism. More and more of us are continuing our education, whether it's on-the-job training, vocational school, colleges and universities. Colleges and universities are beginning to recognize that there's an awful lot of us on the spectrum, due to better research, better awareness, and better intervention, who are making it to college. I remember the first day I started at my university. I met a student assistant, and I guess it just takes one to know one. I just knew that he had Asperger's syndrome, and I thought, we'll get to know each other a little better, and then we're going to have a little talk about the autism spectrum. On the second day, he disclosed to me that he had Asperger's syndrome. In addition, he said he had flunked out of 2 universities before getting to our university. Now he was getting a 4.0 because he was getting the support that he needed. And in our program, students with Asperger's syndrome and related conditions, they get the support they needed pretty much in the form of intensive support for executive functioning and all those other details that you have to pay attention to when you're a college student, social interaction, getting around campus, and so on. And we've just begun to get results from our research which suggests that the grade point average of the students in this program, it's called the Bridges program, have a higher grade point average than the rest of the students. We also see that these students have a better retention rate. So they're sticking around longer, they're not dropping out more than the rest of the student population. So one question that's really interesting is, one, exactly what are we doing to help these students? And then number 2, is there something that we're doing for those students with Asperger's syndrome and related conditions that should be given to the rest of the student population? So that's another question. Relationships, we've got the same diversity of relationships, desires, wants, and needs as the general population. Well, one big thing that gets in our way is education. Because whereas most people get this information from their typical peers, we spend a lot less time, sometimes no time with our typical peers. So where is this information going to come from? Somebody's got to teach it. So that's another area we need to consider. And then the self-advocacy. What can we do to effectively and appropriately advocate for our needs in a way that somebody else can provide support? And that's another important area to consider. So returning to my situation, by the time age 4 rolled around, speech had begun to return. I got admitted to that school that initially rejected me. I got reevaluated. So instead of being considered as psychotic, atypical development, strong autistic tendencies, I got upgraded to neurotic, so things were looking good. Then there were the watch motors. And instead of my parents looking at this as a closed door of maybe strange or atypical behavior, soon they provided all kinds of other devices to take apart. All kinds of devices to take apart. They sat with me, made sure I got them back together again. Had it been an earlier century, I probably would have been a really good watchmaker, a watch repairman. Unfortunately, I was able to transfer that mechanical ability to bicycle repair, which was great for earning money in college. So what did my parents do? They made a big deal about this. They set the stage for self-determination, making good adult decisions. And one key factor in being able to make good adult decisions is knowing where your strengths are and where are your challenges, and navigating to areas of where your high function are, where your strengths are, building that sense of self-awareness. And often that's something that I find people on the autism spectrum are lacking. And what that does is it sets the stage for disclosure. Telling people you have autism, or is it telling a person with autism that they have autism? And how do you do it in a way that respects that respects and focuses on strengths, but at the same time, you're being realistic about what the challenges are. Are there real challenges to having autism? How many of you agree that there are real challenges to having autism? Yeah, they're there. They're significant. If they weren't, we wouldn't be here trying to figure it out. So what can we do to work through those challenges? So moving along, at age 6, I entered regular school kindergarten. The social and academic catastrophe. You know what happens with people who are different in grade school? I guess walking around the classroom saying the letter B over and over again didn't endear me to my classmates. I was usually about a grade behind in most of my subjects. It's often around this time that a person may start asking, why do I have such a hard time at gym? Why is making friends so difficult? How do you tell somebody with autism that they have autism? And again, in a way that focuses on strengths, but recognizes the challenges that exist. Fortunately, I didn't have to go through that. My parents just used the word autism for as long as I can remember. So since about age 5.5, when my speech had pretty much normalized, I knew I had this thing called autism. We didn't know much about what it was, but it certainly helped explain it. That's really going at it. So we talked about autism just like it was any other word. If someone has brown eyes, or brown hair, wears glasses, or doesn't wear glasses. However, I find many people don't learn about having autism that way. And there is this discrete time when you sit down and you have to tell them. So let's take an example of a 4-step approach that I developed that seems to be helpful. I started working with this child at age 5.5 with Asperger's syndrome. His parents just knew with enough intensive activity, we'd early interventionize the Asperger's syndrome right out of him. Well, we fast forward to the teenage years and he still has Asperger's syndrome. And it's more apparent now than when he was a toddler, because life's complexities have begun to overwhelm his ability to cope. And that's one good thing, positive thing that I see about the DSM-5 is that there is language there, that the autistic characteristics may not become noticeable until later in life when life's complexities overwhelm the ability to cope. So that's a good thing. I also see sensory issues being recognized as a characteristic, so that's good as well. So anyways, parents realized the autism's here to stay. They asked me to do the deed. I told them, well, it's a dirty job and Bruce Wayne ain't available because he's busy playing Batman, so I'll do it. So we started the next session. I was giving him music lessons. And before we started, we began talking about his strengths in music, graphic design, and computers. We talked about his challenges in making friends, penmanship, and physical education. He got that pretty fast. This is something that you can start really early. You can start verbalizing this. You can do it through whatever means of communication that individual has. Then we moved on to step 2. Started lining up the strengths and challenges. We decided that since he was so good at computers, let's just write your papers using the computer and be done with it. And there are 2 important aspects to consider here. One is, what strength can we use to accommodate for a challenge? And then 2, there's a word that I haven't used yet since I began. What word is that?
Challenges.
Somebody said it.
Difficulties?
Somebody might have said weakness.
Accommodation?
Yeah, I guess I didn't use that. There's a lot of words I haven't used. Some of them you don't want to hear. The idea is weakness. I don't like to use that word because it's a static word, it's a negative word. If we think about all of the IEPs in the strengths and weaknesses section, what if we took the word weakness and replaced it with challenge? Then that would give a sense that this is something that we can overcome, we can work around, we can work through, we can accommodate for, or maybe even make a considered decision to ignore the challenge. And what I mean by that is, for example, I find that I'm very low functioning in a noisy bar. Too much sensory input, too much nonverbal communication, too much social interaction. Now I know that I can undergo auditory integration training for the hearing sensitivities, perhaps even magnesium. I know that I can learn more about social interaction and nonverbal communication. Or I could just decide that I can lead a fulfilling and productive life without going into these establishments. So that's what I mean by blowing off a challenge. I'm just going to blow that one off. Then step 3 is looking at other people's strengths and characteristics. And the idea is that different people have different strengths and different characteristics. I guess just the best thing to say is that I'm the dummy who wrote it. And what this does is it sets the stage for successful self-advocacy, making your needs known in a way that others can understand and provide support. So just briefly, looking at self-advocacy, let's take a look at a process that everybody goes through, but perhaps many of us on the autism spectrum will need direct instruction. Everybody's got these directions. Or it might be that you're not sure you're going to remember them all. So you go through a 3-step process. You realize there's too much to remember. You advocate for yourself. You don't have a meltdown, hopefully. You don't bite and kick or scream at the person giving you directions. You don't pull their hair. You ask them for an accommodation, something that's reasonable, something they can do. And then you give the reason why. So there's 3 steps to self-advocacy. Scanning the environment for challenges, developing an advocacy plan, and then giving the reason why. And the disclosure might be a partial or a full disclosure. In this case, we've got a partial disclosure. I'm just not going to remember it all. Or, if I'm in a place that has a lot of overhead lighting, well, those overhead lights are really bright. They give me a headache. I must have sensitive eyes. I'm not going to get into the characteristics of autism, and sensory issues being one of them, and that standing under a spotlight is like standing under a recessed lighting, like the ones we get over there, is like looking into a spotlight for other people. So that's what I mean. These are some of the things that we need to look at as we consider educating individuals with autism in effective self-advocacy. At age 8, I'd spend hours cracking open small rocks with big rock. I was fascinated with the shiny specks inside. That eventually led to special interests, or fascinations in geography, geology, many others. Astronomy was another one. Most of the time in elementary school, most of my time in elementary school was spent going into the library, getting a stack of books on my favorite subject, reading them, taking notes, copying diagrams, then turning them over and reading them again, at least until the next interest took hold. I remember in 3rd grade, I had a stack of astronomy books on my desk, busy reading, and a teacher told me that I'd never learned how to do math. But somehow I figured out just enough math to teach statistics at the university level. Now the good news is that an educator would probably notice this as a special interest and figure out that they could teach math through this special interest, making the curriculum intrinsically rewarding. Everybody learns better about what they're interested in. If you're interested in something, you're probably good at it as well. And for those of us on the autism spectrum, it's just to a greater extreme. Bicycles became a special interest of mine. It took me a while to learn how to ride a 2-wheeler. I was fascinated by all the spinning parts. I got it to a point where I could take a bicycle, park down to the ball bearings, spokes, and then put it all back together again.